folks, Based on a True Story, the podcast that compares your favorite Hollywood movies with history. Today, we're going back to the year 1953 to learn about that classic film, Titanic, the one that was released long before James Cameron's blockbuster. I'm sure you know the basic concept of the film, thanks to Cameron's version, if nothing else, but let's refresh our memory on the 1953 version with a quick synopsis. The movie is set during what we now know as the maiden voyage of the RMS Titanic in April of 1912. And according to the movie, the legendary luxury liner is carrying over 2,000 passengers from Southampton to New York. The story centers on the troubled Sturgis family, with the father, Richard, and his estranged wife, Julia. Richard is played by Clifton Webb in the movie, while Julia is played by Barbara Stanwyck. As part of the movie's plot, Julia is secretly planning to leave Richard and start a new life in America with the kids. That's her reason for being on Titanic. And then Richard discovers her plan and buys his way onto the ship at the last minute in an attempt to stop her. And the voyage is supposed to be a smooth crossing to New York, but family tensions escalate as Richard and Julia battle over their children's future while still trying to maintain appearances among high society. Meanwhile, their teenage son Norman finds himself caught between his parents, while their daughter Annette finds a budding romance with a young man named Gifford Rogers. He is played by a very young Robert Wagner. Then the tragedy occurs. Titanic strikes an iceberg on the night of April 14th, tearing a fatal gash in the ship's hull. The family crisis immediately transforms into a fight for survival as the unsinkable ship begins its deadly descent into the icy waters. As the ship tilts and chaos erupts, the Sturgis family, along with the other passengers, face the horrifying reality that there aren't enough lifeboats for everyone. The personal battles that seemed so important just hours before become meaningless as passengers desperately scramble for their lives while others are resigned to their fate. To help us separate fact from fiction in the movie, I am excited to chat with Mark B. Perry. Mark is a Golden Globe and Emmy-winning writer and producer known for his work on classic TV series like Picket Fences, The Wonder Years, Law & Order, and Party of Five, just to name a few. On top of his work in Hollywood, Mark is also a founding board member of the SS United States Conservancy. And he actually co-wrote a Titanic movie even before James Cameron had his. So we'll be sure to ask him about that too. Before we connect with Mark, though, let's set up two truths and a lie. Now, if you're new to the show, this is something we do on every episode to help you practice what this show is all about, separating fact from fiction. So I'm going to give you three facts that you'll hear about in this episode, but one of those is just an all-out lie. Are you ready? Okay, here they are. Number one, Captain Smith ordered the band to play Nearer My God to Thee as Titanic sank. Number two, 1953's Titanic came out before the definitive book by Walter Lord was published. Number three, only 712 people survived and about 1,500 people perished in the disaster. Got him? Okay, now as you're listening to our story today, listen closely to see if you can figure out which one of those is a lie. And if you're watching the video version of this, you can see I'm holding up the envelope. This has the answer inside, so we're going to open this up at the end of the episode to see if you got it right. All right, now it's time to connect with Mark B. Perry about the historical accuracy of 1953's Titanic. Well, thank you for coming on to talk about Titanic, Mark. And before we get started, as a screenwriter, can you share how you got interested in the Titanic?
Yes, I am a self-professed ship geek. It's one of my most passionate hobbies. I'm not an expert, but I know a little bit about a lot of things as a result of a lot of research that I've done over the years. I love 20th century ocean liners. I love ocean travel. I love the Normandy, the Queen Mary, the Queen Elizabeth, the New Amsterdam of 1938, the QE2, the QM2, the contemporary ocean liner. I'm a big collector of memorabilia, furniture, artwork, china, silverware, that sort of thing. And I'm a founding board member of the SS United States Conservancy, which is a nonprofit that is working to preserve the legacy of my favorite ship, which is the 1950s era ocean liner, the SS United States. So as I say, I am a ship geek as a hobby, but I am a screenwriter professionally. And to that end, in 1988, before I got my first professional break on The Wonder Years in 1989, I wrote a screenplay with a writing partner, a wonderful writer named Dudley Sanders. And We wrote it. We sent it to the agent that was representing me at the time. She called on a Sunday and left a message on my answering machine. This was 1988. And she said she had just finished reading it. She was so excited that Monday morning they were going to send this script to every studio and every producer in town. There was going to be a bidding war. This was going to be a huge success. Congratulations, kiddo. Monday came. They sent the script everywhere, all over town. Everybody passed and everybody said the same thing, a version of the same thing. This is a great script, but it would be the most expensive movie ever made, and nobody cares about the Titanic. So, yeah, true story. So that came about because when I was a kid, I saw a movie called The Last Voyage with Robert Stack and Dorothy Malone. It was from the early 60s. And in it, they actually partially sank an old ocean liner, the Ile-de-France, which was one of the most famous liners of its era. And when I saw that as a kid, I was fascinated by the ship. So I really got interested into ships. And then, of course, I read Walter Lord's book, A Night to Remember, all about the Titanic disaster. And it wasn't until the mid 80s when the National Geographic documentary came out about Bob Ballard finding the wreck and the story of the Titanic that I got re-energized about the story. And I reread A Night to Remember, and there was one passage in there. It was, I think, about 2 sentences, and it was a surviving crew member recounted the story of just after the ship struck the berg, that a passenger came up to him out of nowhere, holding ice in his hands where he had scooped it up where it had shaved into the deck, threw it at the officer's feet and said, as if it had been an ongoing debate, "Will you believe me now?" And that's all Lord wrote, was that little exchange. And I thought, that's really interesting. So the script that we wrote was not a Jack and Rose story. It was a time travel action adventure film set aboard the Titanic. But because we didn't want to come across as, exploiting a real life tragedy where real people died, we decided that we were going to work really hard to make sure that our version of events was as accurate as it could possibly be, out of respect for the people who died and the events of that night. So we scripted the ship breaking in half, which had never been confirmed before or portrayed in any of the films, because it wasn't really known until Ballard found the wreck in 2 pieces. And you may see the Revell model behind me. I built that while we were writing the script, and I'm not a model maker. The funnels are the wrong color. But the point was, we wanted a 3-dimensional reference as we were plotting out the action of our script while the ship was sinking. And again, trying to stick as close as we could to the established history. And since we did that, research back then, there was no internet. So we had to, we went to the bookstores, we bought everything we could get our hands on. And so that's why my interest has endured in the story of the Titanic. But when it comes to my love of ships, I'm actually more drawn to the ones that were that did what they were designed to do, and not the ones that failed. But so anyway, that's how I came to know I can hold my own in a cocktail party if the subject of the Titanic comes out.
Well, the movie that we are talking about today is 1953. So even before the timeline of when you were writing your version of the story as well. And here on the podcast, being based on a true story, most of the movies that we talk about start with some sort of variation of based on a true story. But the movie that we're talking about today goes a little bit further than that. I think I'm going to quote what the opening text is from the movie. It says, "All navigational details of this film, conversations, incidents, and general data are taken verbatim from the published reports of inquiries held in 1912 by the Congress of the United States and the British Board of Trade." And while it does only mention the navigational details, it also kind of generically says the general data. So the impression that I get as I read that when I started watching this movie was that this is trying to be more than based on a true story. It's trying to be as accurate as possible. So as we start our discussion today about 1953's Titanic, if you were to give it a letter grade for its historical accuracy, what would it get?
First of all, I want to preface everything by quoting Walter Lord, who I think is the definitive. He said in his first book, A Night to Remember, "It is a rash man indeed who would set himself as final arbiter on all that happened the incredible night the Titanic went down." So, to be clear, I'm not a rash man. But historical accuracy of Titanic 53. This movie was made before Walter Lord's book came out. This book was 53. His book came out in 55. And Lord's book is considered by many to be the Titanic Bible. And because he was able to interview dozens and dozens of people who survived the sinking, who were still alive in the 1950s, though even he admits that it can't be 100% accurate because of human memory. Eyewitnesses are notoriously fallible, and stories would change. People swore they saw Captain Smith saving a baby, in the water before he went down. Others swore they saw him on the bridge. So this is what I think about this film. I think that they really tried. I think with what they knew at the time, they really tried. And it wasn't until 5 years later, when A Night to Remember, the movie, came out that was based on Walter Lord's book, that was much more of a documentary-like dramatization of the sinking. But in this one, as for Titanic 53, I love this movie because it's a soap opera first, and it's a good soap opera. The script won an Academy Award, and it's also a soap opera disaster movie hybrid. And I think more than based on a true story, we could say it's inspired by a true event. The focus of this movie is the Sturgis family. Barbara Stanwyck and Clifton Webb as Richard and Julia Sturgis. And it's how the disaster plays a role in their relationships and not the other way around. And on that level, I think the movie works really well. So the navigational details may indeed be correct and taken verbatim from the reports that were available. But remember that those hearings were held very quickly after the survivors arrived in New York. And they didn't ask all of the questions of the people who were available, and not everybody was testifying. So they didn't know as much in 1953 or 52 when the writers were working on the script. And they didn't have a lot of photographs of interiors of the ship and things to go. And they did not have the absolute wealth of information that we have now. So in fairness to the filmmakers, I think that they were making do with what they had in terms of reference. So as for the general data, that may refer to the timeline of things like, which boat left when, how many people. But this film is not really beholden to historical accuracy despite its lofty claims at the top. And I think it's trying to set the stage to say, we want to be respectful to the true story. But not unlike what Dudley and I were doing, I do think that they were trying to be respectful, and they just didn't have the material research available. There's a famous story about the night they were filming in the tank on the back lot when they were lowering the lifeboats, and Barbara Stanwyck was in one of the lifeboats and she started sobbing uncontrollably, not as the character, but as the actress herself. And it was because she was suddenly overcome with the reality of what they were reenacting in this movie. And from what I've heard, that sentiment also pervaded some of the crew as well. But in the end, they had to answer to Darryl F. Zanuck, and the accountants at 20th Century Fox. So, they couldn't throw as much money, certainly as Cameron did, to make his film. But I think they get a fair amount right. The film is often disparaged in Titanic circles, but they don't always take it in context of the fact they didn't know as much as we do now. And I think little things like there's a brief moment once Clifton Webb as Richard Sturgis gets aboard the ship, and he's this pompous snob, wealthy guy, but he pauses to recognize a stewardess, and he calls her by name, and he mentions the ship that he recognizes her from. And that was apparently a very real thing among the wealthy people of the time. That they would make a point of knowing the people who waited on them on these ships. But in this movie, there's no mention of Thomas Andrews being aboard. And of course, he was aboard. He was the ship's designer, and he played an incredibly important role in the events of that night. Also, there's a version of that with Bruce Ismay in this, who was the White Star Line representative, who, by all accounts, was pressuring Captain Smith to, go faster, break the speed record. He died in the 1930s, so I'm not sure why they felt that they had to fictionalize him. There's someone named Mr. Sanderson, who's a fictional character, who's representing the White Star Line at the beginning of the movie, but he disembarks in Cherbourg, does not even take the maiden voyage. And I think that must have been the 20th Century Fox lawyers being worried about the estates coming after them, because Ismay died in the 30s. Also, the maiden voyage was not sold out as it is depicted in this film, and it's used as a device for Clifton Webb to, sort of buy a ticket from a third-class passenger. He could have just bought a first-class ticket, but in the movie they're going for drama, and so the ship is sold out, but he's got to get on that ship, and he buys a ticket from Mr. Uskadung, who's with his family. And that way, like I said, there's plenty of room in first class, but the film certainly goes for the more dramatic setup. And that gives his character a chance to prove that he isn't entirely a heartless snob when he makes an effort after the ship hits the berg to return to third class, find Mrs. Uskadum and her children, and get them into a lifeboat. Maud Young, the character who's played by Thelma Ritter, is clearly Molly Brown. But again, the lawyers at 20th must have been nervous, even though Molly Brown died in the 30s, and the unsinkable Molly Brown was still a good 7 years away. It wasn't until the 60s that the play and then the movie was made. So one bit of trivia that I want to share, and I'm going to answer your question, by the way. I'm going to give you my rating. But one bit of trivia that I find fascinating is more of a continuity error than a historical inaccuracy, and that is they depict the ship striking the iceberg on its starboard or right side, which is accurate. But then they cut to an underwater shot and they show the hull of the ship being ripped open by the iceberg, and it's on the port or left side of the ship. Then they cut to the inside cargo hold where some men are fleeing as the tear is in real time going down the side and the water spilling in. And again, based on the way the ship was moving, that's also on the port or left side of the ship. Then it cuts back to the ship, and the ship is again, with the iceberg to starboard. And all they had to do was flip the negative on those two shots. And my theory on that is I think that the director, John Negulesco, realized that by flipping the shots and keeping it accurate, suddenly the ship would be moving right to left when it hit the berg, but it would then be moving left to right when it hit the hull. And I know this is a little confusing, but I think he left it that way because that way all of the action is consistent from right to left, both above water and underwater. And only a nerd like me would probably notice something like that. And then go into a dissertation about it. But anyway, the film depicts an alarm going off when they're loading the lifeboats. That did not happen. They did fire signal flares, but there was no siren wailing throughout the loading. The interiors of the ship, they're more evocative. They're certainly not reproductions. And again, there were only a handful of photographs available at the time. But I think on the scale of lavishness of what they're depicting, I think, they get the general ambiance. And the orchestra music in this, the ship's orchestra, is much more 1920s than it is 1910s. And the dancing that people are doing is more 1920s. The Titanic orchestra was all piano and string instruments. So in terms of historical accuracy, to answer your question with a very long-winded answer, I give it whatever the razor thin line is between a B and a C minus.
I really like that you were talking about the historical context of it, because that's something that I hear a lot of, a lot of different stories that in history it's hard for us now to kind of put yourself in, especially going back into ancient times or things like that. But even with this one in particular too, because mentioning James Cameron's movie in 1997 is kind of, that's what everybody thinks of with Titanic. And so even, watching this, it's really hard not to compare this to that movie and to just assume that, okay, James Cameron's movie showed it this way. So let's compare it to that, even though, as you point out, like they didn't even know a lot of that stuff. And that leads right into my next question, because in Cameron's 97 movie, we see these lavish sets and obviously a lot more money put into that than the 1953 Titanic movie. Do you think the 53 movie did a good job transporting us back to being aboard the Titanic from a visual perspective?
Does the film visually transport us back to the ship? Does it do a good job? And I'm going to give them props, and that's an intended pun, for the 28-foot model and the exterior shots on deck, all of which were sets. And they're pretty convincing for the time, especially when you consider this was before CGI, it was before AI, and before whatever other eyes are coming down the pike toward us. But I think it was much easier for audiences in 1953 to suspend disbelief because they hadn't yet been made completely immune by seeing anything imaginable rendered on film in a reasonable facsimile of reality, like people flying and anything you might see in a Marvel movie. As I said earlier, the interiors of the ship are evocative, and they didn't have the visual resources for the designs. We have a context now from all the material, the endless documentaries, everything. We have so much visual reference that they just didn't have in 53. So I cut them some slack in this regard. The sets, I think they captured the lavishness and the scale and the ambiance of what a liner of that class would have been like back in the day, but they're not exact replicas. And the iconic staircase is actually laid out more or less like the actual staircase aboard the ship, the one in Titanic 53. But again, the version to beat on that count is Cameron, who was obsessive about getting every rivet on the models of the hull in exactly the right place. And he had endless amounts of research, including having seen the wreck with his own eyes, diving down to the wreck of the Titanic. So I think for the time period, again, all in context, I think they did a pretty good job of putting us aboard a ship in 1912.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Again, it goes, with Cameron's not only having that extensive research, but also had a little bit of a bigger budget and better technology to work with. So, being able to do that. And again, with the 53 movie, it was black and white too. So, you're capturing some of those lavish things is going to suspend belief a little bit more.
There was talk about making the film in color in 1953, but then they realized that the models would probably not look as realistic in color, which I think is a good point. And again, for the special effects that were available at the time period, I think they do a serviceable job. It's always funny when you cut to the ship sinking and there's clearly no people on the deck, but they had little motorized lifeboats with the oars moving in one of the shots. And so, they really tried. They really did try with what they had available at the time.
You mentioned his name, and early in the movie, we meet Captain Edward Smith. And this movie seems to make a point of mentioning a flag that Captain Smith had when he was an apprentice on another ship called the Star of Madagascar.
Star of Madagascar.
When I saw that, it made me curious about why the movie would mention that. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but the impression that I've always had is that even back in 1912, the maiden voyage of Titanic was a big deal. And the movie seems to allude to this. So as you talk about, talks about it was sold out since March, although you already mentioned that that's not necessarily true. But then the only experience that it mentions for Captain Smith is him being this apprentice. So that left me with the impression after watching the movie that maybe Titanic's maiden voyage was also Captain Smith's first time being a ship's captain, but then that just kind of seems to be a juxtaposition of this big deal. How experienced was Captain Smith prior to taking command of Titanic?
Well, first, I can see how you would take that away from this particular film and the way Smith is depicted. But Smith was actually one of the most experienced captains of vessels on the North Atlantic. The Star of Madagascar, as far as I can tell, existed only in the same universe where the Titanic's maiden voyage was sold out. So I can find no reference to the Star of Madagascar. And I've always personally, I mean, I've seen this movie 100 times, and I've always found that an odd beat. I was like, what were the writers trying to convey with it's delivered to him on the bridge and he says, run it up the main mast. And, then there's that moment at the end after the ship is sinking and he's going down with the ship. And that's what he looks up and sees. And I'm like, maybe they were trying to give us some sort of sentimental backstory to humanize him in some way. I mean, we'll never know because the writers are all dead. And I don't know, but it's an odd beat, but it's weirdly effective. And at the same time, I don't know what it's accomplishing. So, and if it casts dispersion on Captain Smith's experience, that's an unfortunate upshot of what I think they were trying to do. But Smith was very experienced. He had over 40 years at sea as a Commodore or captain for the White Star Line, and he was their go-to whenever they would introduce new ships. And in fact, he had commanded 17 White Star Line ships in his 40 years, including the maiden voyage of the Titanic's older sister, the Olympic, about a year before the Titanic maiden voyage. Wealthy people at the time also very often chose their ship based on the captain, not on the vessel. And Captain Smith had his own groupies who followed him around from ship to ship, which I found to be a very interesting little factoid. But in truth, in some ways, Captain Smith's abundant experience, I think, may have actually worked against him the night of April 14th. And to clarify, I want to read you a famous quote of his. He once said, "I will say that I cannot imagine any condition which could cause a ship to founder. I cannot conceive of any vital disaster happening to this vessel. Modern shipbuilding has gone beyond that." And I wonder if that played a part in his apparent nonchalance about the ship's speed, the ice warnings, if he felt that the ship was indeed impervious, but we don't know. It's all speculation at this point, but I do find that interesting that he did apparently say that, and that's what he believed. And what's even more poignant, I think, about the Titanic is that opposed to it being the first time he commanded a ship, it was to be his last. He was going to retire after the maiden voyage once he got back to England. And to me, that's a very tragic, bittersweet note to this man who had this long and storied career.
I wonder if maybe, this is just my speculation, as you mentioned that, if this was going to be his last, if the writers of the Titanic 53 knew that, and then because the flag, from the Star of Madagascar, it mentions him being an apprentice. So maybe it's kind of trying to do a bookend, like this was, the flag of his first ship, and then this is going to be his last, if he was going to retire after that was maybe some. I'm just thinking out loud as you mentioned that.
That's very interesting. That had not occurred to me, but I think that's a solid theory.
Well, you mentioned their names earlier, and this main storyline throughout the movie follows Richard Sturgis, his wife Julia, and their two kids, Annette and Norman. Do we know if they're based on real people on Titanic?
Not that I know of, but they are certainly amalgams of real people, real wealthy people of the time, and certainly real people who were aboard the ship. So I would say kind of yes and no. Now, in the film, Barbara Stanwyck is basically, she's kidnapped her children, and she wants to save them from, a life of insufferable snobbery growing up with Clifton Webb. And there was, on the actual Titanic, there was a man aboard who had kidnapped his children in a custody dispute and was taking them to the United States. And the children survived, but the father perished in the sinking. So it's possible that Charles Brackett and Richard Breen and Walter Reich had read about that particular passenger, and that may have been the inspiration for the inciting incident of Julia kidnapping or taking the kids away from him. But again, of course, we'll never know.
That leads into another tie-in. Speaking of Annette, the daughter in the 53 movie, That's another tie-in to the James Cameron 97 one, which is a young love story. And that one, it's Annette and then a young guy named Gifford Rogers from the Purdue tennis team on his way home after playing Oxford during Easter. And it's not an exact copy of, the 97 movie with Jack and Rose, but then it's hard watching the 53 movie now not to compare it to the 97 movie and be like, oh, on Titanic, there's both these love stories. Do we know of any romances like that actually happening on Titanic?
Well, first of all, let me just say this. If you look at old Hollywood films, so many of them take place at least partly on some glamorous ocean liner. Doris Day's first movie, Romance on the High Seas, Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, the Marilyn Monroe, Jane Russell film, and The Lady Eve, which is one of my favorites, which is a Preston Sturges movie, which coincidentally also stars Barbara Stanwyck. And in it, she's a con artist and she's seducing Henry Fonda. And there's a scene where they're out on deck at night. It's very romantic. And she says something like, a moonlit deck is a woman's business office. And so there was a great romance associated with the old steamships and ocean voyages. And the idea of shipboard romances has become a trope and a cliche. Did they happen on the Titanic? I think it's very likely that they did because people are people. And when you're on a ship, there is a romantic aspect to it. I mean, I've crossed the Atlantic on the QE2 and the Queen Mary 2 and the Old France as the Norway, and there is a romance to it. It's a very unique experience. There was a woman aboard the Titanic, and her name was Helen Candee, Candee, and she was traveling alone, and she had written a book about how women can make a living. So I think she was a pioneer of women's rights, and good for her. She was traveling alone, and she caught the fancy and the attention of a handful of male passengers. And as Walter Lord describes it, they formed this little coterie of suitors with Miss Candee. And so who knows? If I had to guess, I'd say yes. There are probably more than one shipboard romance, but the chances are that many of them likely had very unhappy endings, given what happened to the ship. Related to this, in Cameron's film, Leonardo DiCaprio, Jack, he dies because there isn't room for him on that ginormous piece of wood.
I think we all saw the Mythbusters on that.
that saves Kate Winslet. Yeah, there's a debate about that. But that serves that story really well because there's a tragedy at the heart of the tragedy, a personal tragedy at the heart of the tragedy. And I find it interesting that in 1953, which was closer in time to 1912, that the writers went out of their way to have Gifford, Robert Wagner, be a hero. He's the one who shimmies down when the lifeboat gets tangled. He's the one who shimmies down, gets it free, gets it moving again. And then it's when he's trying to climb back up to rejoin the men that he loses his grip, falls into the water. He's pulled into a lifeboat. He's unconscious. And that's how he survives. And that way, he's not depicted as being dishonorable for not staying with the other men aboard the ship. And I think it's an effective moment, but I also really thought that's what they're doing, is they're trying to justify him being able to survive. The Jack and Rose scenario, sadly, is probably closer to real life because so many of the third class passengers perished.
That leads right into my next question that I have for you, because we talked briefly about Richard Sturges in the 53 movie. He buys a third class ticket to get in. And in the 97 movie, Jack wins a third class ticket. And it's interesting because we don't really see, in both of those movies, we see the first class and the third class. They don't really talk too much about a second class, but then both movies seem to imply that you can't move around very much. In the 53 movie, after Richard gets his tickets, he deliberately moves a sign that says first class passengers only to go from third class to first class in the top portion of the ship to where his family is. Can you unravel some of the different classes that were aboard Titanic and how their experiences differed?
Yes. This was something we researched quite a bit because in our script, the female sort of love interest, it wasn't really a love story, but she was an Irish immigrant single mom who was traveling in steerage or third class, and our protagonist, our time-traveling hero, he ends up finding himself first in first class, but he spends the movie divided between the two. And we didn't really get into second class, although Titanic 53, there is a brief sequence where Barbara Stanwyck escorts the defrocked drunken priest played by Richard Basehart, another fictional character, by the way, down to his stateroom. And that's the only time I think we see a second class stateroom. Then there was a 1970s made-for-TV movie called SOS Titanic with Cloris Leachman and David Warner. And David Warner played a real-life character, Lawrence Beasley, who was a survivor of the Titanic who was traveling in second class. So that film did a little more in second class than other films have historically done. And coincidentally, David Warner, who played Lawrence Beasley, is also in Cameron's movie playing Lovejoy, who is the henchman of Billy Zane's character. And so he's an actor who has the dubious distinction of being on the Titanic twice. But in a contemporary context, the first class aboard the Titanic was probably more like Claridge's Hotel in London, which is considered to be one of the finest, most luxurious in the world, or maybe a Four Seasons or a Ritz-Carlton. Whatever the passengers wanted was available. They were pampered like the patrons on the show, HBO's show White Lotus, with one exception that really surprised me. Everyone always talks about how this ship was the pinnacle of luxury, and it may have been for 1912, but only some of the first class suites had private bathroom facilities. And most of the first class had shared bath facilities with other first class passengers. And to take an actual bath, you had to make a reservation with your cabin steward or stewardess, which I thought that was interesting. I would have assumed that in first class, they're paying that much money, they would have their own bathrooms. But no. Second class is more like a Marriott or a Holiday Inn. It's still nice, but it's not quite as opulent or as luxurious as first. My late friend, who was a historian and a writer, her name was Sylvia Stoddard, and she was a Titanic fanatic. And she said that from her research, second class aboard the White Star Line's Titanic was more like first class aboard other liners from other shipping lines of the day. So that says a lot about what first class must have been like. But the second class cabins had bunk beds, not regular beds, and they too had shared bathroom facilities. All of the second class had shared bathroom facilities. Third class, we're talking Super 8, Best Western, Motel 6. They were also equipped. They were equipped with bunk beds. Some of them, I think, had up to 12 or 14, and so you would buy actually space in a bunk if you were traveling either with you or just your family, and you may have to share quarters. And all of the bathrooms, of course, were shared in third class. And according to two sources, there were only 2 bathtubs available for third class, one for men, one for women, which I found to be pretty interesting. That said, people back in the day said that the third class on the Titanic was the best third class accommodations on any vessel at the time. So from what I've read about the separations between the classes, it wasn't as regimented as it's usually depicted. Yes, there were some physical barriers, there were gates, but there were also chains and signs like we see in Titanic 53 when Clifton Webb lets himself into first class. It's hard to imagine, but I think back then they still paid attention to the honor system. And I hate this expression, but I think people sort of knew their place. And so, they didn't break the rules. Yes, as I said, there were gates and there were barriers, and some of them were in fact locked and sort of thing, but it was not impossible, according to our research, for someone to move from one class to another if they were determined enough and in some cases sneaky enough or rich and entitled.
Which then makes sense in the 53 movie, how it would be so easy for him to go from third class to first class and just fit in.
Exactly.
Well, if we go back to the 53 movie, there are a few different scenes where we see mentions of an iceberg report. The one it focuses on most is a telegraph sent to Captain Smith from the commander of SS Baltic about an iceberg at latitude 41 degrees 51 north, longitude 49 degrees 52 west. And despite this, Captain Smith orders Titanic to go 21 knots. And doing the math on that, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's like 24 miles per hour, 39 kilometers per hour. Going that fast seems to be something that one of the crew in the movie, Mr. Lightoller, is concerned with. So he asks Captain Smith about it. And Smith reassures Lightoller that they'll be able to see any icebergs in the daylight. And so he'll personally be on the bridge in the morning to watch out for those. And just to help with some of the numbers, I looked up Titanic's top speed, and it is about 23 knots, so 26 miles an hour, 43 kilometers an hour. So her service speed was 21 knots that we see in the movie. And then, of course, looking at this with the historical context, it's easy to see why, with what happened, why the speed with the icebergs would have been such a big deal. But then the movie seems to suggest that maybe it wasn't that big of a deal. So with that in mind for how the movie portrays things, how well do you think the movie does explaining the iceberg reports and then Captain Smith's orders to maintain Titanic speed?
It's a good question. According to Walter Lord, again, the Titanic received at least 7 ice warnings from ships like the Baltic, the Caronia, the America, the Mesaba. And there may have been more, but the radio operators were very busy sending personal messages for the passengers who were basically playing with this brand new toy, the high tech of its day, the wireless telegraph. And they were sending personal messages about, oh, we expect to arrive in New York at such and such a time. Please have such and such available. And it was a source of revenue for the White Star Line. And so the operators were sending outgoing messages, which meant that not some incoming messages. And in fact, in some cases, the operators aboard the Titanic told the people sending them messages to shut up and get off the line because they were sending messages through the Cape Race relay to the United States. So some of them probably didn't even get through. But that said, I'm not sure. I think in the movie, if I'm recalling right, it's the Baltic message that the captain flips over and writes the coordinates of the ship. I don't think that's true. I think he did receive the Baltic message in real life. Would it have made any difference? I don't know, because Captain Smith believed that shipbuilding had gone past the kinds of accidents they had. But this was a night of what ifs. This was a night of if this hadn't happened, if this hadn't happened, if this had happened. I heard a theory recently that said that the iceberg, which I had never heard this before, and I haven't researched it, so I may be talking out of turn, but they said that the iceberg that they hit had broken off and flipped over and was a dark blue on the bottom, and which there was no moon that night. And it made it almost impossible to see until they were right up on it. Whether or not that's true, I don't know. But Smith, by all accounts, was pretty nonchalant about the ice warnings. And again, I think it's because of his overconfidence in shipbuilding and being unable to envision any circumstance where a ship like this would actually founder. So again, not being the final arbiter of these things, my guess is the movie does a pretty good job in his attitude, if not the actual facts as they played out aboard the ship. And pretty much what he did, I think, was supported by contemporaneous accounts in those hearings and from survivors who were there.
I had never heard that theory about it flipping over, but that brings up a good point of something kind of touching on what you were talking about before of, if we don't even, especially during the 53 movie, they didn't even have pictures or that much information there. And then even now, like how would you possibly be able to know about a specific iceberg in 1912, whether or not it had flipped over? It's not like there were footage I just, that kind of thing. I know there's a lot of scientific stuff that people can do. It just blows my mind, but how we can jump to those sort of conclusions that we might know that, this one particular iceberg might have flipped over and that's why they couldn't see it that time. And it's like, okay, maybe, but also sometimes I think we just have to be okay never knowing what actually happened.
Well, I think that's true. And like I said, I prefaced that. I heard that recently, and I have not substantiated it, but I thought it was interesting. But it still seems like that didn't need to be part of the equation. I think if it had just been an iceberg as it's portrayed in the Cameron film and the 53 film, and in A Night to Remember, it's just a big white iceberg coming up out of nowhere. I mean, there was no moon that night, and it was difficult to discern those shapes at the speed that they were moving and to maneuver properly in time. And, you know, again, you go back to eyewitness accounts. That's all they had in 1953, that they only had what was on the record from people who were there. And those people weren't carrying HD and 4K cameras in their pockets. The ship was not being charted by satellites. They weren't in constant two-way communication with other ships. It was a very different time. And so, there's so much speculations. There's there's the crazy conspiracy theory that the ship, the Olympic and the Titanic, were switched for some reason that I don't think I've ever clearly understood. But, it's fascinating to me that over 100 years after this happened, we're still talking about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, human memory is not great, but also to add to that too, everybody who survived had still gone through this extremely traumatic event. And so that's going to affect memory as well. And just all these different, we're just never going to know all the facts.
Clearly people can misremember. People can also make things up, whether they mean to or not. I mean, they might change their story because they didn't run back to get the little boy who had fallen in the water, and they just left them. Who knows? We're fallible.
Yeah, very, very true. Well, if we go back to the movie, we do see. We see a little bit, but there's not a lot of dates and locations displayed outright. Like, a lot of movies have the text on screen, but we get some clues here and there, kind of what the path that the Titanic is taking. At the beginning of the movie, for example, there are some signs that are in French. That's when Richard Sturgis boards the ship, getting his ticket. And after they start making their way to the open ocean, Richard is having dinner with his family. He asks his daughter Annette what day it is, and she says it's April 13th. And then later in the movie, one of the sailors on the ship looks at the clock. The movie makes him notice that the clock is at 11:36 p.m. on April 14th, and that's just before they see the iceberg in front of them. So based on these little clues that we have, do you think the movie does a pretty good job portraying the dates and places for Titanic's timeline?
I think they do an excellent job in this case. The movie seems to be pretty accurate in the timeline. Maybe that's what they meant by "quote unquote" general data in the opening statement. The Titanic set sail on a Wednesday, which was April 10th, 1912, from Southampton, England, and there she was docked and the passengers boarded by gangway in the traditional fashion that we usually see in the movies. Interesting factoid, the loading was done opposite of modern day air travel in that they put the third class passengers aboard first before the first class and second class passengers boarded. I don't know why, but apparently that was protocol of the day. Once she was fully loaded, she set sail. She arrived a few hours later in the French port of Cherbourg that you mentioned, and that's where Titanic 53 picks her up, basically. Then they take on more passengers who come aboard by tender or the smallish ferry boats that bring them out to the ship, because the harbor at Cherbourg did not have docking facilities that could accommodate a ship the size of the Titanic. So incidentally, one of those tenders, the Nomadic, survives to this day. It's been restored. You can visit it in Belfast, Ireland. And it was also designed by Thomas Andrews, who designed the much bigger sister ship, the Titanic. Only the Nomadic is still afloat after all these years, unlike the Titanic. While they were in Cherbourg, this is where we see Julia and her children boarding along with Maud Young and other characters coming out on that tender. And that's also where we see Richard Sturgis getting aboard by buying his ticket from the Uskadoos and then sneaking up. And let's see. So then there were passengers who disembarked in Cherbourg. There were about 24 who left the ship because they had only booked passage to cross the channel. And I imagine they spent the rest of their lives with some pretty interesting cocktail party stories about having, just narrowly missed doom. And then from Cherbourg, the ship went to Queenstown, Ireland, they've changed the name and I'm blanking on what it's called now, but that isn't even shown in Titanic 53. But it did stop in Ireland on Thursday, the 11th, midday, and then early afternoon, it set sail for New York and, of course, infamy. April 13th would have been the Saturday. And that's when Annette says that the next day is when they're in church on Sunday and they're singing the hymn. And then by Monday morning, of course, the ship would be lost. And, the story of the investigations and everything would begin. So in terms of accuracy, I think they got this, with excluding things for time's sake, I think more than anything else. I think they did an excellent job. In fact, I'm going to upgrade my rating to a solid B at this point.
Okay. Nice.
If that's permissible.
Oh, yes, of course. Well, we are at the point then, if we go back to the movie, we're at the point in the timeline where Titanic strikes the iceberg. It's mere moments after it's sighted, according to the way the movie's timeline is. But Captain Smith is not on the bridge when the first actions are taken to avoid the iceberg. But we can hear orders like hard or starboard and full speed astern, keep the helm hard over. And then the movie cuts to the underwater shot that you're talking about, where you see, the iceberg actually slicing the hull. And then at this point, it cuts to Captain Smith, and he can feel the impact from where he's on the ship. And he rushes to the bridge, and he's informed that they picked up a spur. There's no damage above the waterline, but the forepeak is flooded to the orlop deck. There's additional damage abaft of the bulkhead B, and they're taking water in number 1, 2, and 3 holds, and number 5 and 6 boiler rooms. And in the movie, Captain Smith seems surprised that there's damage that far aft and asks if they can shore up. No, is the reply, and they've been cut open like a tin can. And that's basically a summary of the movie's version of events, and there's a lot of nautical terminology in there that I would hope that you can help help explain what some of that is. But is that basically what happened?
Well, no.
I'm sorry. Does that bring the grade back down to the B?
No. I'm sticking with the B at this point. I got a soft spot in my heart for this movie. So is that really what happened? Again, it's a rash man indeed. Who knows? But from what we do know, the commands on the bridge, hard to starboard, full speed astern, all of that was pretty much exactly right. And it's depicted in the film. And I believe it's the same thing in Cameron's film. And that came from testimony at the hearings, because there were officers who survived who were there, who knew what was going on. Captain Smith in Titanic 53 is sort of having a waxing, sentimental, poetic moment, watching the kids sing their school anthem. And I think I don't know if they're in the ballroom, the restaurant, or where they are. But anyway, he was actually in his cabin, which was next to the wheelhouse on the bridge. And he did feel the impact. But it is very unlikely that the crew had that much information at their disposal the way it's portrayed in the film. In reality, Smith ordered inspections. He's the one who ordered them to go down and do the inspections. And he also summoned Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, who again isn't in this movie, conveniently. And I think the writers were taking license to just condense all the shoe leather so that they don't have to play out every step, because they want to get back to, they just want to set up the stakes that the ship is going to sink. What's going to happen to the Sturgis family? And it seems unlikely that Smith, given his history, and again, that quote, it seems unlikely that he believed the ship was doomed from the get-go. And he sent an officer below to inspect the damage, and he then subsequently learned that the forward compartments were flooding, the mail room was flooding, taking on water fast, and he ordered the ship's carpenter to go down and shore up the damage as best they could. And when Smith was told that the ship foundering was a mathematical certainty by Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, he would know. That's when Smith really knew that this was inevitable. So there were several steps in his process. I think some of it may have been denial, but some of it was also doing what he possibly could to try to buy as much time as he could. And I just think the film, for dramatic purposes, condensed all of that. Because again, despite their claim at the beginning, that wasn't really the focus of this particular film.
That makes perfect sense. And that then leads into my next question, because according to the movie, after hearing about this damage, it's almost immediate that Captain Smith just knows that the ship is going to go down. One of the very first things we see in the movie is he orders the forward pump started, and then he rushes to the wireless telegraph room where he orders a CQD to all vessels. And then, the movie, through dialogue, very helpfully explains, one of the officers or the telegraph operators, like, that means a full distress. Yeah, we're going down, basically, what Captain Smith says. So do we know? I'm assuming then that we don't know if Captain Smith immediately knew that they were going to sink. But then, if that's the case, would it be a fair assessment that that order that the movie points out that he says, starting the forward pumps, that's basically just trying to delay the inevitable to try and buy time for the lifeboats?
I think it was trying to buy time for the lifeboats. Based on what I've read, what I know about it, which again, it's all speculation, but I think, yes, they did have pumps and they could buy some time by pumping out the water. But at some point, they get overwhelmed and the ship goes down. So, but I do think he had so few options. And as soon as Andrews told him it's a mathematical certainty, which that's apparently a direct quote from what he said. But he didn't survive, of course, so who knows. But I think once those words were said, then Captain Smith knew he had to do whatever he could possibly do to buy as much time as he could as the ship was going down. And he also simultaneously said, muster the passengers, put them off in boats, women and children.
Those are the kind of things I can't wrap my head around, what that receiving that news must be, especially if with that quote that you mentioned from Captain Smith, just the assumption that this could never happen. And we all think of, the Titanic is unsinkable in that whole aspect. And then to hear that it's a mathematical certainty, that just has to be absolutely devastating. I don't know what sort of reaction to have to that. I mean, unfortunately, we'll never know, but that's just...
It's chilling. And I think the actor who plays Captain Smith in Titanic 53, I think he plays that moment pretty well, of the realization and, oh my God, what do we do? And the captain, still today, the captain is responsible for the ship. They are the last word. They are the for good or bad, they get the credit and they get the blame.
Yeah, the buck stops here, as they say.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, speaking of the lifeboats, at this time in the movie is when we find out that they don't have enough lifeboats for everybody. Captain Smith orders the women and children in lifeboats because there aren't enough for the men. Can you share some more historical context about the lifeboat situation on Titanic?
Well, I'm going to say something controversial, which is the Titanic actually had more than a sufficient number of lifeboats.
Okay.
To meet the outdated regulations of the time.
Ah, okay.
Ships had grown in size so fast and mankind so arrogant, apparently, that they didn't want to clutter the recreational space on the boat deck with quote unquote non-essential equipment that would block the view for the first class passengers out for a stroll on the boat deck. So there were 16 boats, 16 wooden boats, and that's 8 on each side of the ship, 4 forward and 4 aft. And there, between the forward and aft boats, there was about 200 feet of open deck, as you see in the film, where the passengers could enjoy the view as the ship was sinking. I don't mean to make light, but it's just so absurd to me that they didn't take safety so as seriously as we do now. And one of the reasons we do now is because it happened.
They're called lifeboats. I mean, that's pretty essential. It's in the name, lifeboat. Yeah.
All of those boats, those 16 boats, the two in the front were smaller. They were slightly smaller, but they were still the wooden lifeboats. Those satisfied the regulations of the day. But the Titanic was equipped with 4 additional collapsible lifeboats, which were stowed up on one of the, I don't know what you call that, it's one of the platforms on the boat deck. And they were lashed there, and they had some trouble getting them down. But those exceeded the requirements. And that's why I say that the Titanic actually had more than sufficient lifeboats to meet the regulations at the time, because they did have these other collapsible boats that could, once the other boats had been lowered from the davits, these collapsible boats could be fit into those davits and lowered away. Some of the passengers were aware of the disparity between the number of boats and the number of people aboard. Others were not. And it is true, according to testimony, that some of the first-class gentlemen were let in on this dire news, and so they could act accordingly. And as for the haphazard use of the boats, going away with a handful of people, there had been no boat drill for the ship. It wasn't done. It wasn't required. And even as the passengers were told to muster at their muster stations, which is where they're supposed to gather to get on their lifeboat, the crew was still telling them that the ship was unsinkable. And so imagine yourself, it's freezing cold out. It's like 28 degrees, freezing cold. You're standing on a solid ship. There's lights, there's heat, there's jaunty music playing from somewhere aft from the ship's orchestra. And then there's a little wooden boat hanging 70 feet above the frigid water. And so a lot of people would not get in those boats. And so some of them went away with a handful of people. So if I may, I'll go into the weeds with the lifeboats. But all told, there were, as I said, there were 14 largest boats could accommodate 65 passengers each. The 2 smaller cutters at the bow, they were called cutters, they were the wooden boats, they had a capacity of 40 people, and the 4 collapsible boats could handle 47 people each. And that's a total capacity of 1,180 souls, if all of them had been fully loaded.
And the movie said, I think there were 2,200 or overall on the Titanic, just to kind of...
There are around 2,200.
Okay.
The number is still not, has never really been certified because there were discrepancies in the passenger list and so forth. But there were, let's say, 2,200 aboard the maiden voyage. So even fully loaded, the boats would still have been insufficient for some 900 people who died. But had they been fully loaded, they would have been able to save close to 500 additional lives than what they were able to save. But hey, even God himself couldn't sink this ship, right?
What you mentioned there about how the crew was saying that the ship is unsinkable, that reminds me of something that I saw in the movie where, as people are being told to line up for the lifeboats, this is the movie's version of events. Everyone's, donning their life jackets, and the crew is sending up distress flares, but then they're still telling the passenger there's no cause for alarm. Even as in the movie, we can hear alarms blaring across the ship, which seems pretty stark contrast to that. And then there's, it seems pretty obvious that they're trying to keep everybody calm, but it doesn't really take very long in the movie for people to start to realize what's going on. The movie really focuses on Richard Sturgis and his family. And he tells them, they're probably just going to row out a few hundred yards while they repair the damage. His wife, Julia, then thanks him for lying to them. And they try to seem to make up their differences in the final moments that they have. And there are a lot of tears in the movie, with only one exception of a man pretending to be a woman to get on the lifeboats. Most of the men seem to be resigned to their fate. Do you think the movie did a pretty accurate job of portraying this tension and then the realization among the passengers as they boarded the lifeboats?
Again, I think it did capture the drama of the moment. I'm not sure if it captured the accuracy, the who was where and which person was in which boat. But there are cases that Walter Lord writes about of men reassuring their wives, as Richard does in the movie. And, it's just a precaution and so forth. And while knowing that they themselves were doomed, as Richard Sturgis does in the film. And but that gives him, for the soap that and the drama, that gives him that great moment with Norman, when Norman sadly, tragically gets to quote unquote be a man, which is his whole thing in the movie. He wants to wear long pants. He's grown up. And so he's going to become a man, which means he's going to perish with the other men, the other gentlemen aboard the ship. And in terms of the drama and the tears and the fear and the terror as the reality of it begins to dawn on these people, the goodbyes, the stoicism of the men and the other people who stayed behind, I think the film captures the drama of that really well and is pretty powerful. But again, if you want to get into the weeds on the actual timeline, you got to look to Mr. Cameron's opus.
That's fair. And it does still go back to, especially in a moment like that, because that's the moment when there is the most panic. Relying on the witness reports is going to be the most, for lack of a better way to say it, the most inaccurate. I mean, that's when the most panic is. So that's when the misremembering, trying to piece together things after the fact, I would imagine that would be the most difficult element to remember as things are flashing by so quickly.
Rational thought goes out the window. It's all about, do I jump? Do I stay? I mean, I cannot imagine the terror of that situation.
Well, if we go back to the movie, as the lifeboats are lowered and they row away, the band plays Nearer, My God, to Thee. Everyone left on board sings along, and the movie cuts to some shots of people in the lifeboats. They can hear the songs being sung as Titanic starts to pitch forward. All of a sudden, things accelerate very quickly in the movie. There seems to be some sort of an explosion. The movie doesn't really mention what's happening here, but there's some dialogue earlier talked about the ship being finished once the water hits the boilers. So that's what I was assuming the movie's trying to portray is water hits the boilers. There's an explosion of steam, perhaps. But in the movie, we see the bow fully engulfed in the water. The water just kind of starts bubbling at the surface. And then there's rumbling that knocks everybody off their feet, stops them from singing Nearer, My God, to Thee. And then within a few seconds, she slips beneath the waters entirely. Do you think the movie did a pretty good job recounting what we know of Titanic's final moments?
For the time. Once again, I'm going to put everything in this film in context of what they knew at the time. So I think they tried to do a good job, a respectful job of depicting the final moments based on what they knew. And with the technology they had available at the time, which was basically models, miniatures, and, air canisters so they could blow, the water could bubble as the ship goes down and that sort of thing. There's always been lively debate about the whole Nearer, My God, to Thee thing, or whether it was Nearer, My God, to Thee or a popular tune of the time called Autumn, which was a waltz. But the Nearer, My God, to Thee thing is such a, I don't know if romantic is the right word to use, but it's so evocative. I think it's kind of become Titanic gospel, if you will. But Walter Lord writes about it in his sequel to A Night to Remember that came out in the 80s called The Night Lives On. And in this film, they start playing, in Titanic 53, the captain asks them to start playing, and it's much later in the process. And in truth, the captain didn't ask them. Wallace Hartley, the band leader, he was the one who instigated it, which is portrayed pretty accurately in the Cameron film. And they were playing light music of the day. They were playing ragtime. They were playing, waltzes. They were playing popular songs because the whole idea was to take people's minds off of, what was going on and keep everybody calm. Interestingly enough, Nearer, My God, to Thee was the original title of Titanic 53 until somebody wisely suggested that they change it. But witnesses at the time, again, with the testimony that they had, they basically said they saw the bow going under, and then that accelerated as the water rose. The decks began to slope precariously, making it impossible for people to stand. And we see all of this in the film. The musicians eventually fell, and the music stopped. The lights went out. Then there was a steady roar in the real witness accounts. There was a steady roar, which was apparently the sound of all the heavy machinery, the dishes, the glassware, the furniture, the pianos, everything breaking loose and hurtling toward the submerged bow. We only see some of this in 53. It is shown in horrifying, vivid detail in Cameron's film with the dishes and everything else. As the stern rose in the air in the real incident, the forward funnel detached, fell into the water. It's depicted in Cameron's film. They do not show that happening here. It may have been beyond their capabilities to make that look realistic. Then in real life, the ship did go perpendicular for up to 2 minutes, according to witnesses, and the noises stopped. And the stern then settled back slightly, then slowly began to slip, picking up speed as it went. Now, in Titanic 53, we don't see it do this, but we see it stay at the angle and then hang there for a moment and then begin to sink and pick up speed. And that settling back might well have been, as the witnesses who saw it, that may well have been the ship actually breaking in two at the time. But we didn't know that for sure until the wreck was found by Ballard in the 80s. And I find it interesting that of all the people who testified, were interviewed, only 3 swore they saw the ship break in half, and all the others said that that did not happen. And so that goes back to speaking to the reliability of eyewitness testimony. So I think it puts a big caveat on all of this. As for the explosion that's portrayed in 1953, they were basing that on testimony of one seaman who said that he survived, and he said that he heard an explosion before the ship went down. But when Ballard found the wreck, there was no evidence of a boiler explosion. There was no evidence of an explosion. There was evidence of the ship having been strained to the point of breaking in half. But it is possible that the bulkheads, when they were going down, the bulkheads finally giving way with all of that pressure, could have made explosive sounds. And who knows what a huge ship actually sounds like when it literally breaks in two. So I think they opted to rely on that one person's testimony because it makes for drama. It accelerates the sinking in the movie. It says this happened and that's why this happened. And that's how Richard Sturgis dies with his son without ever having shared his true parentage, because again, it's a soap opera.
Well, you make a great point too of how would we know what it actually would have sounded like. That goes back to, relying on witness reports, but even they wouldn't be, you hear this big noise, you wouldn't be able to identify exactly what that is, because there's a lot of noises, I'm sure, that were happening, and being able to identify what they were, not easy to do.
Yeah, I give Cameron big props for and his crew and the sound mixers, because if you have to imagine that and try to create that, I think they did an exceptional job, because that's a horrifying moment in the Cameron film, which I recently rewatched as research before we have our talk today.
Well, we started our discussion today with the text at the beginning of the movie, so it seems fitting to end in a similar fashion, because the movie ends with voiceover that gives us a few details about the tragedy. And I'm going to quote the voiceover from the end of the movie. Thus, on April 15th, 1912, at 02:20 hours, as the passengers and crew sang a Welsh hymn, RMS Titanic passed from the British registry. 712 people in 19 lifeboats survived. I found it interesting that the movie mentioned the number of survivors and lifeboats, but didn't mention how many souls were lost. So I have a 2-part question as we start to wrap up our discussion today. First, is the part the movie included in the final voiceover accurate? And secondly, can you fill in some of the historical details that the movie doesn't mention?
By all accounts, there were 712 survivors. And most estimates put the loss of souls at around 1,500, which is an interesting omission in this film, because to me, that's the more horrifying statistic, actually. But again, this number isn't really known, because we don't actually know how many people were aboard the ship, because they weren't all scanned by computers. They didn't have wristbands like they do today. And there were discrepancies in the passenger list. There were people who were on the printed passenger list who did not make the voyage, and same for the crew. So I want to go back to the singing of the hymn. because you mentioned the Welsh hymn, and the movie says Welsh hymn. Well, as many people insist that the band didn't play the hymn because their goal was to calm the passengers and not serenade the arrival of death or whatever. But if they had actually played or sung "Nearer My God to Thee," as Walter Lord points out, the British version has a completely different melody than the American version, and not everybody would have known the song by the same melody, so it would have been a cacophony as opposed to the way it's depicted in Titanic 53. Years ago, I bought an excellent CD called Titanic Music is Heard on the Fateful Voyage, and it's by Ian Whitcomb and his orchestra, and they do authentic recreations of the music from the ship. And they do a performance of this waltz called Autumn. And for me, I like to think that that's the last tune that the band played. People may have said prayers, they may have sung hymns, but that's what I prefer to think because it's a very haunting, beautiful melody. Another interesting thing is that 2 of those 4 collapsible boats that could have carried however many people I said earlier, they apparently floated away with nobody in them. And so of a total of 18 boats, the 16 wood and the 2 collapsible, that's all that survived. But if those other boats floated off and there was a sea full of people flailing, it's hard to understand why they wouldn't have done. One of the collapsibles, as we've seen, was upside down, and they managed to get aboard it and keep it afloat all night until they were rescued. So it's hard to imagine why that happened. And I wonder actually if those boats were still lashed to the ship and went down with it. And that's why there's no account of those two missing collapsible boats. And then finally, the Titanic was never advertised as being unsinkable, but was generally referred to that way. And that was repeated enough that people believed it, even apparently Captain Smith. But when you look at the persistent fascination with this ship, all the TV shows, the documentaries, the coverage of that tragic submersible implosion that happened 2 years ago, going down to the dive of the wreck, the movies, the operas, the musicals, the books, nonfiction and fiction, and on and on. As I said earlier, this was 100 years ago, but it's still this tragic confluence of events that happened that night and resulted in everything that it did. It still resonates. It's still relatable for people, and it still fascinates us. And in that way, as Walter Lord points out, the Titanic herself may not have been unsinkable, but the legacy of the Titanic is certainly unsinkable.
Well, you mentioned at the very beginning that you had written your own version before Cameron's version came out. If let's say that you were in charge of a new adaptation of Titanic's story, is there anything you would change or anything based on the new information that's come out since you wrote that originally?
I probably wouldn't do it.
Because it would be compared to Cameron's, and that's because that just seems to be the one that everybody's like, this is what happened.
Of course. I mean, Cameron, whatever we think of all the Jack and Rose stuff in the film, it made it a blockbuster hit. It's a movie that I don't know that I've ever met anybody who hasn't seen it, which is rare. And I think he has set the standard for generations to come. And it's also known as, the studio execs prophetically said to us, this will be the most expensive movie ever made, which at the time it was. And so they were right, even 10 years before. But, especially a movie where everybody already knows the ending. That said, I do think that the script that Dudley and I wrote, and again, trying to be respectful, but still tell an action-adventure time travel movie, I think that it removes one of those obstacles, because in our script, you don't know what's going to happen to the ship, because the hero has the moral dilemma of, do I try to save these people, or do I let history take its course and the ship founder? And all of the positive developments that came from the tragedy, like lifeboats for all, duh, and 24-hour wireless communications, and people receiving wireless as well as sending them on the ships, and the safety of life at sea regulations that are constantly being updated. So a lot of positive things resulted from this horrible tragedy. But in our movie, you don't know what's going to happen. So if somebody from Netflix is a fan of your show, maybe they'll give me a call. I don't know.
When you're talking about the time travel, have you ever seen Final Countdown? I think it's called, where they go back in time to and they have that same sort of description. Like, do we stop the attack on Pearl Harbor? Do we stop this from happening? I mean, that was the first thing that came to mind when you talk about not even really knowing, are they going to let history play out? Is this going to be that same sort of dilemma in the movie that takes an event that we all know what happened, but is it really going to happen this way in this movie?
Right. Well, we wrote our script first.
I mean, yeah.
We didn't get it made, but we wrote it.
Fair. Well, I'd love to switch away from the 53 Titanic movie to another story of yours, your debut novel called And Introducing Dexter Gaines. And I've got a link to that in the show notes for everyone to pick up their own copy. And while they do that, can you share a sneak peek of your book?
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate you asking. In addition to my love for ships, I love old movies. I love old Hollywood, and I love historical fiction. And as a side note, I also love time travel stories, obviously. But when I decided to try my hand at fiction, I wanted to myself time travel back to the twilight of Hollywood's golden age. And this is not a time travel novel. I'm just saying, me as a writer, I wanted to experience it, to put my head in the heads of those characters and that time period. And I wanted specifically to set it in the early 1950s, when TV was a threat to the movie business and when the studio system was beginning to change and be phased out. And I wanted to tell an unconventional story that starts with one of the most well-known tropes, which is a young person coming to Hollywood to become a star. And in my case, he's a young man from Texas with matinee idol good looks and the unfortunate name of Dan Root. And he's escaping a troubled past. He arrives in town. He falls in with one of the most powerful couples in Hollywood. And it's a hotshot producer at 20th Century Fox who produced Titanic 53. His name is Milford Langan. And his wife, Lillian Sinclair, who's a glamorous movie star, who's kind of on the cusp between fame and fade out, as happens to women in this cruel industry. And together, Millie and Lily, they mentor Dan and transform him into a promising young actor, and they rechristen him Dexter Gaines. That's going to be his big movie name. And it becomes an unconventional love story about heartbreak and redemption and sexual awakening. And it's told as a kind of emotional mystery that's set in two time periods. It's set in 1994 when Dan returns to Hollywood to confront his demons, and the early 1950s when he first gets his first bitter taste of stardom. And we know from the very beginning of the book, there are no spoilers here. We know from the very beginning of the book that his time in Hollywood ended up being a spectacular failure that ended in violence and attempted murder. But the story is about this man finding self-absolution in the ultimate truth that he uncovers from the literal and figurative ruins of his past. And I'm happy to say it's been on one of Amazon's bestseller lists since it came out May 6th. And the critical acclaim, the reviews I've gotten so far have been overwhelmingly positive. And I chose the early 50s for a couple of reasons. I wanted a real scene and a real movie that my fictional character Dexter, could have been in when the film was shot and then could have been cut out of before it was released. And I was watching Titanic 53 for the 800th time, and the scene presented itself to me, and I thought, oh, and then I worked backwards from that. And that's how originally I was going to start the book in 1950, but I shifted it to 1952 so that it could accommodate the maiden voyage of the SS United States, which is also featured in the book, and some behind the scenes stuff and the making of Titanic. So if you want to know more about that, I would encourage you to pick up a copy or listen to the wonderful audiobook that was performed by Daniel Henning.
Fantastic. I'll make sure to add a link to that in the show notes. Thanks again so much for your time, Mark.
Thank you. As you can tell, I'm always happy to shoot the ship, as we say. And this was really fun. Thanks for having me, Dan.
This episode of Based on a True Story was produced by me, Dan Lefebvre. Thank you once again to Mark B. Perry for helping us separate the facts from the fiction in 1953's Titanic. As Mark explained at the end, he has a fantastic new novel out called Introducing Dexter Gaines that actually has a scene during the making of the 1953 Titanic movie in it. So check out the show notes for where you can pick up your own copy right now. And of course, you can always find that on the show's home on the web at basedonatruestorypodcast.com/370. Okay, now it's time for the answer to our 2 truths and a lie game from the beginning of the episode. And as a quick refresher, here are the 2 truths and 1 lie again. Number 1, Captain Smith ordered the band to play Nearer My God to Thee as Titanic sank. Number 2, 1953's Titanic came out before the definitive book by Walter Lord was published. Number 3, only 712 people survived and about 1,500 people perished in the disaster. Did you figure out which one is a lie? I've got the answer right here, so let's open up the envelope. And the lie is number 1. As Mark pointed out, the whole idea of the band on Titanic playing Nearer My God to Thee is something that historians have debated pretty much since the beginning. And even if Nearer My God to Thee was played on Titanic, number 1 would still be the lie because in the 1953 movie, it's Captain Smith who instigates the band playing, while the James Cameron version from 1997 correctly depicts it as Wallace Hartley, the band leader, who instigated the music. Thanks so much for sticking around to the end. Before I let you go for today, if you enjoyed today's episode, you're going to love my mailing list. In these days where every social platform has its own algorithm, following or subscribing doesn't really mean what it used to. So I've started up an email mailing list to cut through all of that. You'll find a link to the Boats email newsletter in the show notes, along with all the links that we've talked about today. Or you can always reach out to me at dan@basedonatruestorypodcast.com if you want to share an idea for a future episode, or maybe you just watched an awesome historical movie or TV show and want to talk to someone about it. Until next time, thanks so much for spending your time with Mark and I today, and I'll chat with you again really soon.